The clinking of champagne glasses still echoes in my mind, but not for the reasons you'd think. It was supposed to be a celebration. My younger brother Marcus had just gotten promoted to partner at his law firm, the golden child finally claiming his throne. The whole family had gathered at my parents' house in suburban Chicago for what Mom called a proper celebration. I remember walking into that dining room, the one with the mahogany table that had hosted every major family moment for the past 20 years. The smell of Mom's famous pot roast filled the air, mixed with the expensive cologne my father always wore on special occasions. Everything felt familiar, safe even. I had no idea I was walking into an execution. My father, James Richardson, stood at the head of the table in his pressed white shirt and navy tie, looking every bit the successful banker he'd always been. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his posture commanding as always. He surveyed the room like a general addressing his troops. My mother, Patricia, my brother Marcus, with his perfect wife Jennifer, my sister Claire with her 2 kids, and me. Just me. Still unmarried at 32, still working as a high school English teacher instead of climbing some corporate ladder, still living in my small apartment across town instead of the suburban palace everyone expected. Family, Dad began, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that had commanded boardrooms for decades. Tonight we celebrate Marcus's incredible achievement. Partner at Henderson & Associates at just 29 years old. He paused, his chest swelling with pride as he looked at my brother. Marcus beamed, his arm around Jennifer, both of them glowing with success and satisfaction. Claire raised her glass, already smiling in anticipation of what was coming. Mom clasped her hands together, tears of joy threatening to spill over. And then my father's eyes found mine. For just a moment, I thought I saw something. Maybe regret, maybe hesitation. But it passed so quickly I might have imagined it. "Here's to everyone at this table," he said, raising his crystal champagne flute high into the air. The bubbles caught the light from the chandelier above, creating tiny prisms of gold. "Here's to success, to achievement, to making the Richardson name proud." The room held its breath. I raised my glass too, expecting the usual toast about family and love and being grateful for each other. Instead, my father's voice turned cold, surgical in its precision. "Here's to everyone, except the disappointment." The words hit me like a physical blow. The room went silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of neighborhood kids playing outside. I felt my hands start to shake, the champagne trembling in my glass. He didn't look at me when he said it, but everyone knew. The disappointment. That's what I was to him. Not his daughter Sarah. Not the woman who'd spent her life trying to make him proud. Just the disappointment. "Dad," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. But he was already drinking, already moving on to clap Marcus on the shoulder and launch into stories about his own early career success. The moment had passed for him, just another Tuesday night dinner conversation. Not for me. For me, 32 years of trying, of hoping, of believing that maybe someday I'd be enough. It all crumbled in that single sentence. I set my glass down with trembling hands, the champagne untouched. My throat felt tight, my chest constricted like someone was squeezing all the air out of my lungs. The familiar dining room suddenly felt foreign, hostile. The faces around the table, people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, looked like strangers. "Excuse me," I managed to whisper, pushing back from the table. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the awkward silence. I made it to the hallway before the tears started. I made it to the front door before they became sobs. And I made it to my car before I completely fell apart. As I sat in the driver's seat of my old Honda Civic, watching the warm light spill from my childhood home's windows, I realized that everything I'd believed about my place in this family had been a lie. The disappointment. That's all I'd ever been, all I'd ever be. But as I drove away that night, something else began to grow alongside the hurt. a tiny spark of anger that would eventually become something much more powerful. Because maybe, just maybe, it was time for the disappointment to disappoint them all by finally living up to her own expectations instead of theirs. The drive home from my parents' house took me through the same suburban streets where I'd grown up, past the elementary school where I'd first fallen in love with books, past the park where I'd spent countless hours reading under the old oak tree. But tonight, those familiar sights felt different, like looking at someone else's childhood, someone else's memories. I kept hearing my father's voice. Here's to everyone, except the disappointment. The words played on repeat in my mind as I navigated the quiet streets, each repetition cutting deeper than the last. By the time I reached my apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a converted Victorian house near the school where I taught, I was emotionally drained. I sat in my car for a long time, staring up at the warm yellow light coming from my living room window. Even my own home felt foreign now, like I was seeing it through my father's eyes. Small, unremarkable, disappointing. Inside, I poured myself a glass of wine and curled up on my second-hand couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that tonight wasn't really a surprise. It was just the first time anyone had said out loud what had been true for years. I'd always been different from the rest of them. While Marcus was captain of the debate team and student council president, I was the quiet kid in the corner of the library, reading everything I could get my hands on. While Claire was homecoming queen and sorority president, I was volunteering at the local literacy center, helping adults learn to read. My parents never said I was a disappointment back then, but I could feel it in the way they talked about me to their friends. Sarah's very artistic, Mom would say, like being creative was some kind of medical condition she was trying to explain delicately. She marches to the beat of her own drum, Dad would add, but not in a way that sounded proud. When I told them I wanted to major in English literature instead of business or pre-law, the silence at the dinner table lasted for what felt like hours. When I said I wanted to teach high school instead of pursuing corporate success, Dad actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the kind you make when someone tells a joke that's not funny. "Teaching is a noble profession, sweetheart," he'd said, using the same tone people reserve for talking to small children about their dreams of becoming astronauts or princesses. "But it's not really a career, is it? It's more like a hobby that pays." I remember how that felt, like he'd reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. But I'd pushed through anyway, gotten my education degree, found a job at Lincoln High School teaching sophomore English. I told myself that what I was doing mattered, that shaping young minds was just as important as making corporate deals or winning legal cases. For 10 years, I'd been trying to prove that. I stayed late helping struggling students, organized writing contests, started a book club that met after school. I'd won Teacher of the Year twice, had former students come back to thank me for changing their lives, had parents write letters to the principal about how I'd helped their kids fall in love with reading. But none of that mattered to my family. At every gathering, the conversation focused on Marcus's latest case, Claire's husband's promotion, the grandkids' achievements. When anyone asked about my work, it was always with that polite but disinterested tone people use when they're just being nice. "How are your little students doing?" they'd ask. And I'd tell them about the shy kid who'd written his first poem, or the girl who'd gone from failing to getting A's after I'd helped her discover she was dyslexic. But I could see their eyes glazing over, could feel them waiting for me to finish so they could talk about something more important. The worst part was that I'd started to believe them. Somewhere along the way, I'd internalized the message that what I was doing wasn't enough, wasn't important, wasn't worthy of respect or celebration. I'd started seeing myself through their eyes, the spinster teacher living in her small apartment with her small life, making her small difference in the world. But tonight, sitting in that apartment with tears still drying on my cheeks, something shifted. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was just that I'd finally heard out loud what I'd been feeling for years. Either way, for the first time in a long time, I found myself getting angry instead of just hurt. Who decided that teaching wasn't as valuable as law or business? Who decided that helping teenagers discover their voices was less important than making rich people richer? Who decided that a life spent in service to others was somehow disappointing? I walked over to my bookshelf. Wall-to-wall books that I'd collected over the years, stories that had shaped me, poetry that had sustained me through difficult times. I pulled out a worn copy of Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, a book that had changed my life when I was 16 and struggling to find my place in the world. I opened to a page I'd underlined years ago. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. For 32 years, I'd been living someone else's story, trying to fit into someone else's definition of success and worth. But maybe it was time to start writing my own story. Not the one my family expected, but the one I actually wanted to live. As I got ready for bed that night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life being the disappointment. I was going to figure out what success looked like to me, what a life well lived meant by my own standards. And if that disappointed them even more, well, maybe it was time they learned that their disappointment wasn't my responsibility to carry anymore. Monday morning came too soon, and not soon enough. I'd spent the weekend replaying Friday night over and over, analyzing every word, every look, every moment of that devastating dinner. By Sunday evening, I'd gone through every emotion possible: hurt, anger, sadness, rage, and finally, something that felt almost like relief. The relief surprised me. For the first time in years, I knew exactly where I stood with my family. There was no more wondering, no more hoping, no more pretending that things might change if I just tried harder or achieved more. The disappointment. At least now I knew what they really thought of me. I walked into Lincoln High School that Monday with something different in my step. The hallways were bustling with the usual Monday morning chaos. Lockers slamming, students rushing to beat the bell, teachers clutching their coffee cups like lifelines. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. "Morning, Ms. Richardson," called out Jessica Martinez, one of my sophomores who'd been struggling with confidence in her writing. She was carrying a notebook pressed against her chest, and her eyes were bright with excitement. "Good morning, Jessica. You look like you have something to share." "I finished the short story assignment," she said, practically bouncing on her toes. "I know it's not due until Wednesday, but I couldn't stop writing. I stayed up until midnight working on it." I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with my morning coffee. "I can't wait to read it." "What's it about?" "It's about a girl who thinks she's invisible, but then she realizes that maybe being invisible is actually her superpower." Jessica paused, looking suddenly uncertain. "Is that stupid?" "That sounds brilliant," I said, and meant it. Some of the best stories are about people discovering their hidden strengths. As Jessica practically skipped down the hallway, I thought about her words, being invisible as a superpower. Maybe there was something to that. My first period class was American literature, and we were starting our unit on transcendentalism, Thoreau, Emerson, and the idea that individuals should trust their own inner voice rather than conforming to society's expectations. As I stood in front of my 25 students, I realized the irony wasn't lost on me. Who can tell me what Thoreau meant when he wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation"? I asked. A hand shot up in the back. Tommy Chen, usually one of my quieter students. Maybe he meant that most people are unhappy because they're living the life other people expect them to live, instead of the life they actually want. I felt a chill run down my spine. "That's exactly right, Tommy. What do you think he would say we should do about that?" "Stop living for other people?" suggested Maria Santos from the front row. "Like, stop trying to make everyone else happy and figure out what makes you happy?" The conversation that followed was one of the most engaged discussions we'd had all semester. These teenagers, these supposedly disinterested, distracted kids that society loved to dismiss, were grappling with questions that most adults never bothered to ask themselves. They were talking about authenticity, about courage, about the difference between success and happiness. As I listened to them, I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. These kids got it in a way that my family never would. They understood that there were different ways to measure a life, different definitions of what it meant to matter. During my lunch break, I found myself in the faculty lounge with Helen Nakamura, the school librarian who'd become one of my closest friends over the years. Helen was in her 50s, had never married, lived alone with 3 cats, and was the most fulfilled person I knew. "You look different today," Helen said, looking up from her sandwich. Something happened. I told her about Friday night, the toast, the humiliation, the way I'd left in tears. But as I talked about it, I found that the sting had lessened somehow. "You know what I think?" Helen said when I finished. "I think your father did you a favor." "A favor?" I stared at her. "He called me a disappointment in front of the entire family." "Exactly. He finally said out loud what you've been afraid he was thinking all along. And now you know it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with him." Helen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, in the 15 years I've known you, I've watched you transform dozens of kids' lives. I've seen you stay late to help struggling students, come in early to run writing workshops, spend your own money on books for kids who can't afford them. I've watched you cry over students who were hurting and celebrate when they succeeded. That's not disappointing, that's heroic." "It doesn't feel heroic," I said. "It feels small." "Small?" Helen laughed. "Do you know what Marcus does for a living? He helps rich corporations avoid paying taxes." "Do you know what you do? You help 17-year-olds find their voices, discover their potential, believe in themselves. Which one of those sounds more important to you?" That afternoon, I had my creative writing elective, a class I'd fought to get approved 3 years ago, despite the administration's concerns that it wasn't practical enough. It was my favorite class of the day, filled with kids who wrote poetry about heartbreak, short stories about family dysfunction, essays about their dreams for the future. Today, they were sharing pieces they'd written about moments that changed them. As I listened to their stories, about parents' divorces, friends' deaths, their own struggles with identity and belonging, I was struck by their courage. These 16 and 17-year-olds were braver than most adults I knew, willing to put their hearts on paper and share them with the world. "Ms. Richardson," said David Park, one of my most talented writers, "what about you? What moment changed you?" I thought about Friday night, about my father's words, about the way I'd driven home seeing everything differently. But I also thought about all the moments that had led me here. Every book that had opened my mind, every student who'd taught me something new, every small victory in a profession that the world often dismissed. "I think," I said slowly, "that sometimes the moments that change us aren't the big dramatic ones. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, when we finally stop listening to other people's definitions of who we should be and start listening to our own." As my students filed out at the end of the day, chattering about their writing projects and their weekend plans, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not the kind of pride that comes from external validation or family approval, but the kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. The disappointment. Maybe my father was right about that. Maybe I was a disappointment to his narrow definition of success, to his limited understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. But I was beginning to think that being a disappointment to the wrong people might actually be the highest compliment of all. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating dinner, and I hadn't heard from my family. Not a call, not a text, not even the usual group chat messages about holiday plans or family updates. The silence was deafening, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for their approval or bracing for their criticism. It was during this period of family radio silence that something unexpected happened. I started writing again. I hadn't written creatively since college, when I'd secretly dreamed of becoming a novelist, but had been too afraid to pursue it seriously. "Writing is a nice hobby," my father had said when I'd mentioned it once, "but you need a real career to fall back on." So I'd chosen teaching, telling myself it was still related to literature, still meaningful, still enough. But on a quiet Tuesday evening, after grading papers and planning lessons, I found myself opening a blank document on my laptop. I wasn't sure what I was going to write. I just felt this overwhelming need to put words on paper, to tell a story that had been building inside me for weeks. I started writing about a woman who thought she was invisible, who'd spent her whole life trying to be seen by people who were determined not to see her. The words poured out of me like water through a broken dam, years of suppressed thoughts and feelings finally finding their way onto the page. The story grew over the next few nights. It became about more than just one woman. It became about all the people who'd been dismissed, overlooked, undervalued by a society that only measured worth in terms of money and status. Teachers, social workers, librarians, nurses, all the people doing essential work that somehow didn't count as real success. I wrote about the English teacher who helped a suicidal teenager find reasons to live through poetry. I wrote about the librarian who created a safe space for homeless people during the day. I wrote about the social worker who fought the system to keep families together. I wrote about all the invisible heroes who would never be toasted at fancy dinners but who made the world a better place every single day. "What are you working on?" Helen asked one afternoon, finding me typing furiously in the faculty lounge during my break. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "Maybe a novel, maybe just getting some thoughts out of my head. It's probably nothing." Helen peered over my shoulder and read a few paragraphs. Her eyebrows raised. "Sarah, this is beautiful. You should submit this somewhere." "Submit it where? It's just personal writing, not publication material." "There's a literary magazine in the city, Midwest Voices. They specifically look for stories about working class and middle class experiences. This would be perfect for them." I laughed, but not in a mean way. "Helen, I'm a high school teacher who hasn't published anything since my college newspaper. Real literary magazines don't want stories from people like me." "People like you? You mean talented writers with something important to say?" That evening, I found myself researching Midwest Voices. It was a small but respected quarterly that published fiction, poetry, and essays about life in Middle America. Their mission statement talked about amplifying voices that were often overlooked by mainstream literary publications: working people, teachers, small-town residents, the kind of people whose stories rarely made it into the prestigious magazines. I spent an hour reading their previous issues online. The writing was good, really good, but it wasn't intimidatingly perfect. These were real people writing about real experiences, not MFA graduates crafting experimental prose about wealthy New Yorkers having midlife crises. Before I could talk myself out of it, I polished up the first chapter of what I was starting to think of as my novel and submitted it to their fiction contest. The entry fee was $25, and the deadline was in 2 weeks. Even if nothing came of it, at least I'd be taking my writing seriously for the first time in over a decade. 2 days later, something else unexpected happened. I got a call from my principal, Dr. Patricia Hendricks. "Sarah, could you come to my office after school? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." My stomach dropped. Had I done something wrong? Was this about the budget cuts everyone had been whispering about? Was I about to lose my job on top of everything else? But when I walked into Dr. Hendricks' office that afternoon, she was smiling. Sitting across from her was a woman I didn't recognize, professionally dressed, probably in her 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Jennifer Walsh from the Chicago Education Foundation." "Jennifer, this is Sarah Richardson, the teacher I was telling you about." Jennifer stood and shook my hand. "Ms. Richardson, I've heard incredible things about your work here. Dr. Hendricks tells me you've been instrumental in improving literacy rates among at-risk students." I looked between them, confused. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What's this about?" "The Chicago Education Foundation gives out grants to innovative educators," Dr. Hendricks explained. "Jennifer reached out because they're particularly interested in funding creative writing programs that serve underserved communities. We've received some compelling testimonials about your after-school writing program. Jennifer added. Former students, parents, even other teachers have written to us about the impact you've had. We'd like to offer you a grant to expand the program significantly. I felt like I was in some kind of alternate reality. How much of a grant? $50,000 to start, with the possibility of renewal for up to 3 years if the program shows continued success. You'd be able to offer the program to multiple schools in the district, bring in guest speakers, even publish an anthology of student work. I sat down heavily in the chair across from Dr. Hendrix's desk. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Dr. Hendrix laughed. Sarah, you've been doing this work with your own time and money for years. This would allow you to do it properly, with real resources and support. After Jennifer left with my promise to submit a formal proposal within the week, I sat in my classroom staring at the walls covered with my students' work. Poems about heartbreak and hope, essays about their dreams and fears, short stories that revealed wisdom far beyond their years. For the first time since my father's toast, I felt something that might have been pride. Not the desperate, seeking kind of pride that needed external validation, but the quiet, solid kind that came from knowing your work mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Honey, we haven't heard from you in weeks. Is everything okay? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Everything's fine, Mom. Just busy with work. She texted back immediately. Come to dinner Sunday. Dad wants to talk to you. I almost said yes automatically. The lifelong habit of trying to smooth things over, of pretending everything was normal. But then I looked around my classroom again, at the evidence of work that actually mattered, at the life I'd built that had value even if my family couldn't see it. I can't make it, I typed back. But thank you for the invitation. For the first time in my life, I'd chosen myself over their expectations. It felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the story I'd been writing, about invisible heroes and overlooked contributions. Maybe I'd been telling my own story all along without realizing it. The disappointment. Maybe that's exactly what I needed to be. A disappointment to a system that valued the wrong things. A disappointment to people who couldn't recognize real worth when they saw it. Maybe being a disappointment to them was actually the first step toward becoming a success by my own standards. It was a Thursday evening in early November when everything changed again. I was grading papers at my kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside me when my phone rang. The caller ID showed my sister Claire's name, which was unusual. We rarely talked one-on-one anymore, our conversations limited to family gatherings and group texts about logistics. Hey, Claire, I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. What's up? Sarah. Her voice was strange, tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. Are you sitting down? My stomach clenched. What's wrong? Is it Mom? Dad? It's Dad. Claire's voice cracked. He had a heart attack this afternoon. He's in the ICU at Northwestern Memorial. The words hit me like a physical blow. The pen slipped from my fingers, rolling across the table and onto the floor. Is he... How bad is it? Bad. Really bad. The doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it through the night. I felt the world tilt sideways. Despite everything that had happened, despite the hurt and anger I'd been carrying for weeks, he was still my father. The man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd read me bedtime stories when I was little, who'd cried at my college graduation even though he'd never understood my choices. I'll be right there, I heard myself say. Sarah, wait. Claire's voice stopped me as I was already reaching for my car keys. There's something else. Something I need to tell you before you come. What? Mom she's not handling this well. She's been asking for you, but Marcus thinks it might be better if you waited until morning, until we know more. The implication hit me immediately. Marcus didn't want me there. Even now, even when Dad might be dying, I was still the disappointment who might somehow make things worse. I see, I said quietly. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. I told him he was wrong, but he's He's kind of taken charge of everything, and Mom's just following his lead. She's so scared, Sarah. She's not thinking clearly. I sat back down at my kitchen table, surrounded by my students' essays about courage and resilience, and felt the familiar ache of not being wanted settle back into my chest. "How long has he been in the ICU?" I asked. "Since about 2 this afternoon. I tried to call you earlier, but Marcus said to wait until we knew more. But I couldn't. I couldn't not tell you. You have a right to know. 2 this afternoon." It was now almost 8. They'd waited 6 hours to tell me that my father might be dying. "Thank you for calling," I said. "Keep me updated, okay?" After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and cried. Not just for my father lying in that hospital bed, but for the family that had never really felt like mine, for the distance that had grown so wide between us that even a medical emergency couldn't bridge it. But as the tears subsided, something else emerged. Clarity. I didn't need Marcus's permission to visit my own father. I didn't need anyone's approval to show up for someone I loved, even if that love was complicated and sometimes painful. I grabbed my purse and headed for the door. Northwestern Memorial was a 40-minute drive from my apartment, and I spent every minute of it remembering. I remembered the time Dad had taken me to see Romeo and Juliet at the Shakespeare Theater when I was 14, how he'd held my hand during the balcony scene, even though I was too old for hand-holding. I remembered him helping me move into my first apartment, grumbling about all my books but carefully arranging them on the shelves anyway. I remembered the way his face had lit up the first time I'd brought home a Teacher of the Year award, how he'd insisted on making copies to show his colleagues. There had been good moments. There had been love, even if it came with conditions and expectations that I'd never been able to meet. The ICU waiting room was exactly what you'd expect. Uncomfortable chairs, fluorescent lighting, the smell of disinfectant and fear. I found my family clustered in one corner, my mother hunched in a chair looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, Marcus pacing by the windows in his expensive suit, Claire sitting beside Mom holding her hand. They looked up when I walked in, and the expressions on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Surprise from Claire, irritation from Marcus, and something like relief from my mother. "Sarah," Mom whispered, standing up on unsteady legs. "You came." I hugged her, feeling how fragile she seemed, how much older she looked than she had just a few weeks ago. "Of course I came, Mom. How is he?" "The same," Marcus said curtly. "No change. The doctors are running more tests." "Can I see him?" "Family only," Marcus replied automatically, then seemed to realize what he'd said. His face flushed slightly. "I mean, they're only allowing immediate family. 2 at a time." "I am immediate family, Marcus. I'm his daughter." "Of course you are, honey," Mom said quickly, shooting Marcus a look I couldn't quite read. "We've all been taking turns. You can go in with me." The ICU room was all beeping machines and monitors, tubes and wires connecting my father to various devices that were keeping him alive. He looked so small in that hospital bed, so different from the commanding presence who dominated every room he'd ever entered. I pulled a chair up beside his bed and took his hand. It was warm, but limp, completely unresponsive. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room besides my mother's quiet crying. "I'm here, Dad," I said softly. "I know we haven't been talking much lately, but I'm here." I stayed for 20 minutes, just holding his hand and talking to him about small things, my students, a book I'd been reading, the weather. The doctor said he might be able to hear us, even if he couldn't respond, so I filled the silence with words. When I finally left his room, I found my family exactly where I'd left them, but the atmosphere had shifted somehow. Marcus was still pacing, but his movements seemed less aggressive. Claire was texting someone, probably her husband, with updates. Mom was staring at her hands. "I'm going to stay," I announced. "Sarah, you don't need to," Marcus began. "I'm staying," I repeated more firmly this time. "He's my father too." I found an empty chair and settled in for what I knew would be a long night. Over the next few hours, something strange happened. Maybe it was the forced proximity, or maybe it was the reminder that life was fragile and family was complicated, but still family. But slowly, carefully, we began to talk. Not about the toast, not about the weeks of silence, but about Dad, about his stubbornness and his pride, about the way he'd worked himself nearly to death to provide for us, about how he'd never learned to express love without attaching conditions to it. "Remember when Sarah won that teaching award?" Claire said around midnight, when we were all exhausted and running on hospital coffee. "Dad made us all come to the ceremony, even though it was on a Tuesday night. He took pictures with that old camera," Mom added with a small smile. "He was so proud, but he didn't know how to say it. I remembered that night differently. I remembered feeling like he was there out of obligation, like he was going through the motions because it was expected. But maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe he'd been proud in his own complicated way. He loves you, you know," Marcus said suddenly. It was the first time he'd addressed me directly all evening. "He doesn't know how to show it, but he does. He called me a disappointment, Marcus, in front of everyone." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah, that was really shitty. I should have said something. It wasn't much, but it was something. An acknowledgement that what had happened was wrong, that I hadn't deserved it." We sat in that waiting room until dawn, taking turns visiting Dad, drinking terrible coffee, and slowly remembering how to be a family. Imperfect, complicated, sometimes hurtful, but still connected by something deeper than our differences. When the sun came up, Dad was still breathing, still fighting. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe I was exactly where I belonged. Dad survived the night, then the next day, then the next. What the doctors had initially feared would be a matter of hours stretched into days, then weeks. He was stable but unconscious, his body healing while his mind remained somewhere we couldn't reach. Those weeks in the hospital waiting room changed everything. Stripped of our usual roles and pretenses, forced to confront the possibility of loss, my family and I began to see each other differently. Or maybe we just began to see each other at all. Marcus, it turned out, wasn't just the golden child living a perfect life. His marriage was struggling, had been for over a year. The pressure of making partner, the 100-hour work weeks, the constant stress of billable hours and client demands had taken a toll that none of us had noticed. He'd been seeing a therapist, something he admitted to me during one of our late-night vigils, his voice cracking with exhaustion and vulnerability I'd never seen before. "I haven't been happy in years," he confessed on a Tuesday night around 2 a.m. when it was just the two of us in the waiting room. Claire had gone home to her kids, and Mom was trying to get some sleep in the family rest area. "I keep thinking Dad will be proud when I make enough money, when I get the next promotion, when I finally make it. But I don't even know what making it means anymore." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, for the first time in years. The expensive suit couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he'd lost, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. "When's the last time you were proud of yourself?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. "I don't remember," he finally said. "I just keep moving, keep achieving, keep checking boxes, but I never feel enough. You know?" I did know. I'd spent my whole life feeling not enough, trying to measure up to standards that kept moving just out of reach. "Marcus," I said carefully, "do you actually like being a lawyer?" He laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "I wanted to be a park ranger when I was a kid. Did you know that? I loved being outdoors, loved nature, loved the idea of protecting wild spaces. But Dad said that wasn't a real career, that I was too smart to waste my life on hippie nonsense." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We'd both sacrificed our authentic selves trying to win approval that maybe was never really there to begin with. Claire's story was different, but similar. The perfect suburban life she'd built was cracking at the seams. Her husband worked constantly, her kids were struggling in school, and she'd been battling depression for months while trying to maintain the facade of having it all together. "I feel like I'm drowning," she admitted one afternoon while we watched Dad sleep. "But every time I try to talk about it, everyone just says how lucky I am. Big house, successful husband, beautiful children. What do I have to complain about?" "You can have a perfect-looking life and still be miserable," I said. "That doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you human." Mom, perhaps surprisingly, was the one who seemed most at peace during those long hospital days. Away from the social expectations and family dynamics that usually governed our interactions, she became more herself, gentler, more thoughtful, less concerned with maintaining appearances. "I think I failed you all," she said one evening as we sat beside Dad's bed. "I was so worried about what other people thought, about keeping up with the neighbors and the country club friends. I forgot to ask what would actually make you happy." "It's not too late," I said, squeezing her hand. "None of this is too late." During the 3rd week of Dad's unconsciousness, something beautiful happened. I got a call from Jennifer Walsh at the Chicago Education Foundation. "Sarah, I have some exciting news about your grant proposal," she said. I'd almost forgotten about it in the chaos of the hospital vigil. "Not only are we approving your funding, but we'd like to feature your program in our annual report. The testimonials we received about your work were some of the most compelling we've ever seen." I was standing in the hospital cafeteria when she called, surrounded by the controlled chaos of medical staff and worried families. For a moment, I felt disoriented, like she was talking about someone else's life, someone else's achievements. "I don't understand," I said. "What testimonials?" "Oh, dozens of them. Former students, parents, other teachers, even some community members. There's one from a young man named David Park who credits you with saving his life. He said your creative writing class helped him process his depression and find hope when he was planning to end his life. David Park. I remembered him as a quiet, thoughtful student who wrote beautiful, sometimes dark poetry. I'd kept him after class a few times when I was worried about him, had connected him with the school counselor, had made sure he knew that someone cared. I had no idea the impact it had made. Another one is from Jessica Martinez," Jennifer continued. "She's apparently a freshman at Northwestern now, studying journalism. She wrote that you taught her that her voice mattered, that her stories were worth telling. Jessica, who'd been so excited about her first short story, who'd stayed up until midnight writing because she couldn't stop. I thought about all the students over the years who'd passed through my classroom, who'd maybe learned something about themselves along with Shakespeare and essay structure. There are so many more," Jennifer said. "Parents talking about how you helped their children discover confidence. Other teachers describing innovative methods they learned from you. Sarah, you've touched more lives than you realize." When I hung up the phone, I stood in that busy cafeteria and cried. Not from sadness this time, but from something that felt like recognition. For the first time in my life, I could see my work the way other people saw it, could understand that the impact I'd been making was real and significant and worthy of celebration. I thought about my father lying unconscious upstairs, about the toast that had shattered my world weeks ago. Maybe he'd never understand the value of what I did. Maybe he'd never see that helping teenagers find their voices was just as important as helping corporations find tax loopholes. But for the first time, that was okay, because I could see it. And apparently, a lot of other people could too. That evening, as I sat beside Dad's bed telling him about the grant and the testimonials, his eyes fluttered open for just a moment. Just long enough for him to squeeze my hand, just long enough for me to think I saw something that might have been pride, or at least recognition in his eyes before he drifted back to sleep. The doctors said it was a good sign, that these brief moments of consciousness meant he was fighting his way back to us. But even if he never woke up, even if that moment was all I got, it felt like enough. I was finally enough. Not because he approved, but because I'd learned to approve of myself. Dad woke up on a gray December morning, 3 weeks after his heart attack. I was the only one in the room when it happened. Claire had gone home to shower and change clothes. Marcus was at the hotel making work calls, and Mom was down in the cafeteria getting her first real meal in days. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the fluorescent lights, confusion clouding his features as he tried to make sense of where he was. When his gaze found mine, I saw the moment recognition clicked into place. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper, rough from weeks of intubation. "I'm here, Dad." I reached for his hand, surprised when his fingers curled weakly around mine. "You're in the hospital. You had a heart attack, but you're going to be okay." He tried to speak again, but only managed a few rasping sounds. I called for the nurse, and within minutes the room was full of medical staff checking vitals, asking questions, running tests. But through it all, his eyes kept finding mine, as if I were an anchor in the confusion of his awakening. The next few hours were a blur of doctors and family members and cautious optimism. Dad's neurological functions were intact, his heart was healing, and while recovery would take months, the prognosis was good. Better than anyone had dared to hope during those first terrifying days. It was evening before I had a chance to be alone with him again. The others had gone home to rest and shower, promising to return in the morning. I'd volunteered to take the first night shift, something that would have been unthinkable before the heart attack, but now felt completely natural. "You stayed," Dad said when the room was quiet again. His voice was stronger now, though still hoarse. "Of course I stayed." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, chosen with the precision of someone who'd had weeks to think about what he wanted to say. "I heard you talking to me. When I couldn't respond. I heard you." I felt my throat tighten. "The doctor said you might be able to hear us. You told me about your students, about the grant, about some boy whose life you saved. David Park." I'd told him about David during one of my bedside vigils, about how writing had become this kid's lifeline, how sometimes teaching meant being a counselor and a cheerleader and a surrogate parent all at once. "I also heard what Marcus told you, about me being proud but not knowing how to show it." I waited, not sure where this was going, afraid to interrupt whatever he was trying to work up the courage to say. "That toast," he said finally. "What I said about..." He struggled with the words, his face contorting with something that looked like physical pain. "I was wrong, Sarah. So wrong I don't know how to fix it." The tears came then, weeks of hurt and anger and complicated love spilling over. "Dad, you don't have to..." "Yes, I do." His grip on my hand tightened. I spent my whole life measuring success by the wrong things. Money, status, what other people thought. I pushed all of you to want what I wanted, to value what I valued, without ever asking what would actually make you happy. He paused, breathing heavily from the effort of so many words. "I watched you with those kids who visited," he continued. 3 different students came to see you while I was unconscious. Did you know that? I heard them talking to you, thanking you for changing their lives. I heard that girl Jessica tell you that she never would have gone to college if you hadn't believed in her. I hadn't known about the visits. The nursing staff must have let them come during times when I was away from the room. "That's what success looks like," Dad said, his voice breaking. "Not some fancy law firm or bank account. It's knowing that you made a difference, that the world is better because you were in it. You've been successful your whole life, and I was too blind to see it." "Dad, you're not the disappointment, Sarah. I am. I disappointed you as a father, disappointed all of my children by teaching you that love came with conditions, that you had to earn your worth instead of just being worthy because you exist." We both cried then, me sitting beside his hospital bed, him lying there connected to machines that had kept him alive through the darkest weeks of our family's life. It wasn't the conversation I'd imagined having if this moment ever came. It was better and messier and more real than anything I could have scripted. "I love you," he said when we'd both composed ourselves. "I love your passion for teaching, your dedication to those kids, the way you see the best in everyone even when they don't deserve it. I love that you chose a life of service over a life of profit. I love that you're brave enough to be disappointed in me when I deserve it. I love you too, Dad. I always have, even when it hurt. Over the next few days, as Dad grew stronger and the family began to plan for his recovery, something shifted in all of us. Marcus submitted his resignation from the law firm and started researching environmental law programs, talking about maybe finding a way to combine legal work with conservation. Claire enrolled in a master's program in social work, something she'd apparently dreamed about for years, but had never felt practical enough to pursue. Mom started volunteering at a literacy center, inspired by stories I'd told her about my students. I want to help too, she said. I want to do something that matters. As for me, I threw myself into developing the expanded writing program that the grant would fund. The foundation wanted to create a model that could be replicated in other districts, something that would reach hundreds of students instead of just the few dozen I could serve in my after-school program. The week before Christmas, something wonderful happened. I got an email from Midwest Voices magazine. My short story, the one I'd almost forgotten about in the chaos of Dad's illness, had won their fiction contest. Your piece beautifully captures the dignity and work that society often overlooks, the editor wrote. We'd love to publish it in our spring issue, and we'd be interested in seeing more of your work. Have you considered expanding this into a novel? I read the email 3 times before it sank in. Then I called Helen, who screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. I told you, she said when she'd calmed down. I told you that story was special. What are you going to do now? I thought about the novel I'd been working on in stolen moments between hospital visits and lesson planning. The story about invisible heroes, about people whose worth couldn't be measured in stock options or corner offices. Maybe it was time to finish it. Christmas Eve found our family gathered in Dad's hospital room. Not ideal, but better than the alternative we'd all been facing just weeks before. He was being discharged the next day, cleared to go home with a long list of lifestyle changes and follow-up appointments. I have something I want to say, Dad announced as we were preparing to leave. He was sitting up in bed, color back in his cheeks, looking more like himself than he had in months. James, you should rest, Mom said gently. This is important. He looked around the room at all of us. Marcus in his weekend clothes instead of his usual suit. Claire with her kids climbing all over her. Me with my stack of papers to grade even on Christmas Eve. Mom with her volunteer training manual in her lap. I want to make a new toast, he said, gesturing to the plastic water cups we'd been using for our impromptu Christmas Eve gathering. To my family, to Marcus, who's brave enough to change direction when he realizes he's on the wrong path. To Claire, who's going to help families stay together. To Patricia, who's learned that it's never too late to make a difference. And to Sarah, he paused, looking directly at me. To Sarah, who has been making a difference her whole life, even when her stubborn father was too proud to admit it. To my daughter, the teacher, the writer, the woman who saves lives one student at a time. To the woman who taught me that success isn't about what you achieve. It's about who you lift up along the way. We raised our plastic cups in the fluorescent-lit hospital room, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen by my family. Not as the disappointment, not as the one who'd chosen the wrong path, but as exactly who I was meant to be. To second chances, Dad added softly. To families that fight their way back to each other. To love that survives even our worst mistakes. To love that survives, we echoed. And I knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead in Dad's recovery or our own journeys, we'd face them together. Imperfect, complicated, beautifully human family that we were. 6 months later, my novel was finished. A year later, it was published by a small press that specialized in literary fiction about working-class lives. It never became a bestseller, but it found its audience, teachers and social workers and librarians, and all the other invisible heroes who saw themselves reflected in its pages. But the real success wasn't the book, or the expanded writing program, or even Dad's full recovery. It was the family dinner where he asked me to read a chapter aloud, where Marcus talked about his new job with an environmental nonprofit, where Claire shared stories from her social work internship, where Mom showed us pictures from the adult literacy class she was teaching. It was the moment I realized that being the disappointment had actually been the greatest gift of all, because it had forced me to find my own definition of success, my own path to a meaningful life. And in the end, that path had led me home to a family that finally understood that there are many ways to build a life worth living. The disappointment had become the success story none of us saw coming, not despite my choices, but because of them. If you're listening to my story, maybe you've felt like the disappointment too. Maybe you've sat at family dinners wondering why your choices never seem good enough, why your version of success doesn't count in their eyes. Maybe you've chosen a path of service over profit, love over status, meaning over money, and felt invisible because of it. I want you to know something. You are not the disappointment. You never were. Sometimes the people who love us most have the narrowest vision of what a successful life looks like. Sometimes families get so caught up in appearances that they forget to see the beauty in a life well lived by different standards. Sometimes it takes a crisis to wake everyone up to what really matters. But here's what I learned. You don't have to wait for their approval to know your worth. You don't have to justify a life spent helping others, creating beauty, or making small differences that add up to something profound. The teacher who changes one life has succeeded. The nurse who comforts the dying has succeeded. The social worker who keeps one family together has succeeded. Your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your job title. It's measured by the love you give, the lives you touch, and the courage it takes to be authentically yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you someone else. So tell me, have you ever felt like the family disappointment? How did you find your way to seeing your own value? What would you say to someone sitting in their car tonight crying after a family dinner where they felt invisible? Share your story below. Sometimes we need to hear from others who've walked this path to remember we're not alone. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story reminded you of your own journey, or if it gave you hope for a relationship that needs healing, please share it with someone who might need to hear it too. Because the world needs more people who aren't afraid to disappoint the wrong people in order to become exactly who they're meant to be.